Welcome back, friends. Today's recap follows Zuri, a 35-year-old powerhouse who built a global shipping empire, yet still feels one aching empty space in her life. She has money, influence, and a sharp mind, but time is running out on the one dream she cannot buy, becoming a mother on her own terms. What starts as a private plan turns into a messy return to an old love, a remote village full of watchful eyes, and a choice that forces Zuri to face the very thing she's been dodging for years: real commitment. Stay with me, because every step she takes to control her future ends up changing her heart instead. Zuri's story begins long before her company ever launched a single container. As a child, she was born into a struggling home where both parents were overwhelmed by poverty and constant uncertainty. They loved her, but love did not pay rent or buy food, and they reached a breaking point. Believing they were giving her a better chance, they handed her over to relatives who could provide stability. Zuri was raised by an aunt who had never been able to have children, and who saw Zuri as both a blessing and a burden. The household carried old superstitions, and the moment Zuri's growth seemed slow, whispers began. Some relatives claimed she was cursed. Others said her presence dragged luck out of the walls. The more the adults blamed her for their hardships, the more Zuri learned to survive by staying quiet, working hard, and never asking for softness. That constant suspicion shaped her. She watched adults use fear as an excuse to be cruel, and she promised herself she would never be powerless again. If money was what people respected, then she would chase money with everything she had. If success was what kept people from looking down on you, then she would become so successful no one could ignore her. Growing up in that tense home, Zuri also had one steady companion, a cousin close to her age, who dreamed just as big. He admired her discipline and, over time, developed feelings deeper than friendship. Zuri sensed it and drew a firm line early. She kept him close as family, as a teammate, as someone she could trust, but she refused romance. She wanted control, not complication. Years later, that same drive turned into a business. Zuri founded her own shipping company from scratch, starting with a tiny office and a relentless schedule. She learned routes, ports, customs paperwork, and the brutal politics of logistics. She negotiated like someone who had been underestimated her whole life. The company grew fast, winning contracts that surprised competitors and gaining a reputation for reliability. Her cousin, Greg, became her business partner, taking on operations and easing her workload. Another trusted relative, Brian, joined as the technical brain of the operation, managing systems, tracking, security, and the digital backbone that kept ships and schedules aligned. With Greg and Brian supporting her, Zuri expanded even more, building a workforce of skilled employees and pushing the brand into international waters. On paper, she had everything, but success did not erase the quiet loneliness that waited for her at home. At 35, Zuri began hearing a different kind of clock. It wasn't a deadline for a contract or a shipment. It was biology, and it did not negotiate. She wanted a child, not because society expected it, but because she craved that kind of connection. Someone to nurture, someone to come home to, someone who would feel like family that she chose. The idea of marriage, though, still felt like a trap. She had watched relationships break people, and she hated the thought of giving anyone legal power over her life. She wanted motherhood without a husband, a family without a partnership that could collapse. One day at work, she saw a little girl visiting the office, the daughter of an employee. The child's laughter hit Zuri like a wave. For a moment, Zuri pictured tiny shoes by her door and a small voice calling her name. That evening, she scheduled an appointment with a doctor, expecting reassurance and options. Instead, she heard the truth. At 35, fertility was already declining. Her results were worse than she expected, and time was not on her side. The doctor explained the simplest path: marry, try quickly, and hope. Zuri refused. She pressed for alternatives, and the doctor laid out two realistic choices: freeze her eggs or use a donor. A donor could give her what she wanted without tying her to a marriage, if she found someone willing to sign away rights and walk away clean. Zuri left the clinic with a plan forming in her mind. She spoke to Greg, hoping for support, and he immediately offered himself as the donor. Zuri shut that down. Greg was family, her partner, and always present. She didn't want a man tied to her life forever through biology, especially not someone who would never truly disappear. She wanted a clean line, a choice she could manage. Back at home, she talked with Brian, who lived with her in the same house in a comfortable, sibling-like rhythm. Brian was brilliant and loyal, but he also carried a cynical view of the world. He questioned why anyone would bring a child into such a chaotic era. Zuri argued that wanting a child was not a trend. It was something deep and human. Still, her anxiety grew as she watched news clips of mothers holding babies, feeling her own body counting down. The next morning, Zuri rode to work with Greg and Brian, trying to focus on ordinary conversation while her mind raced. That's when she spotted him. At a street vendor's cart stood a tall, broad-shouldered man with smooth hair and an unmistakable presence. Zuri recognized him instantly. Andy, the only man she had ever truly dated. The first love she never admitted hurt her. The one relationship that ended before it had time to become anything real. He was standing beside a young woman who looked confident and sharp, and Brian was visibly distracted by her the second he saw her. Zuri called out, stunned. Andy turned, polite but distant, and the young woman pulled him away with suspicion, as if she expected trouble. Back home, Zuri explained it to Greg and Brian. 10 years earlier, she and Andy had dated for about 6 months. It ended abruptly when she learned he was leaving the country. She had broken it off fast, telling herself she was protecting her future, but the truth was that she feared being abandoned. After that breakup, she buried herself in work and decided relationships were not worth the risk. Now, seeing Andy again, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Certainty. He wasn't a stranger. She already knew his face, his energy, his genetic traits she imagined in a child. If she was going to choose a donor, she wanted someone she could trust, someone she had history with. She decided Andy was the answer. Brian, ever practical, dug for information and found Andy's current address. Andy lived in a remote place called Halupi Village, a semi-isolated community reachable by a long trip and a boat ride. Zuri didn't hesitate. She left the city and traveled to the village, watching modern roads fade into rugged paths. The village felt like a different world, tighter, slower, held together by shared routines and mutual dependence. Locals explained they dreamed of building a bridge to connect them to the city because isolation made everything harder: supplies, jobs, medical care, even basic communication. Zuri listened with the instincts of a businesswoman already seeing problems she could solve. Andy's life there was not what she expected. The confident young woman from the city turned out to be his younger sister, BBE. She was outspoken, skeptical, and fiercely protective. Their aunt, who had raised them after their parents died, ran the household with strict love and constant vigilance. The family bond was strong, and Zuri could see how much Andy cared for them, even in small gestures. He sketched, helped neighbors, and led community meetings about farming and self-sufficiency. He was still charismatic, but there was a calm weight to him, as if life had softened his edges. Zuri's arrival did not go smoothly. The village had fewer conveniences than she was used to, and the trip left her exhausted. At the worst possible moment, she needed privacy, and the locals pointed her toward an outdoor setup that felt humiliating to her city sensibilities. In her panic, she stumbled into Andy's path, and the situation looked compromising to anyone watching. Men from the village saw them together and immediately assumed the worst. Later, Andy apologized for the confusion, and Zuri tried to steer the conversation toward their past. That was when Andy revealed the one detail that shattered her neat plan. He had lost his memory. The news hit her like cold water. Andy did not remember their relationship, their breakup, or her name. Zuri's mission suddenly became harder because she could no longer rely on nostalgia or emotional shortcuts. That evening, she sat with Andy's aunt and tried to prove who she was. The aunt interrogated her with questions about Andy's full name, age, and personal history. Zuri answered correctly, and the aunt became convinced that Zuri and Andy had once been close. The aunt admitted that, in another timeline, they might have been perfect together. But she also warned Zuri that Andy had changed. The accident that caused his memory loss had also left emotional scars. If Zuri wanted a future with him, she would have to earn it again. Zuri called Greg and Brian that night, struggling with spotty internet and weak reception. Greg urged her to come home and let him help, but Zuri refused. She insisted she would stay, rebuild a connection with Andy, get what she needed, and leave. The plan sounded clean in her head, but the village was not a place where secrets stayed hidden. The aunt also pulled Zuri aside with a protective threat, explaining that Andy's parents had split, his father had taken his own life, and Andy carried deep fear around love and loss. The aunt made it clear she would not allow anyone to break Andy again. Still, Zuri pushed forward. She inserted herself into daily life, joining Andy in the fields and learning the rhythm of farm work. She tried to charm him with playful energy, turning chores into moments of laughter, always testing his reactions. She staged small dramatic moments, hoping to trigger tenderness. Andy remained respectful, cautious, and slightly confused by her intensity. He was not cold, he was guarded. The more Zuri watched him, the more she realized he wasn't the same man she had dated. He was steadier, more rooted, and more committed to the people around him than to any wild ambition. BBE watched Zuri closely too. She was blunt about her beliefs, saying love rarely lasted and that couples eventually broke apart. She feared repeating her parents' tragedy, and she distrusted romantic promises. Zuri tried to argue that life felt incomplete without children, but BBE warned that children suffered when relationships failed. Their debates forced Zuri to confront her own contradictions. She wanted a child, yet she feared the structures that often supported families. Then Brian arrived in the village, and the situation got even more tangled. He claimed he came to support Zuri, but it became obvious he had a personal reason. He was drawn to BBE from the moment he first saw her. Brian tried to impress her with charm, but BBE shut him down with sarcasm and distance. Zuri was irritated, feeling like Brian had turned her serious mission into a romantic side quest. Still, Brian brought something important, a letter from Zuri's doctor confirming that her time window was shrinking fast. The urgency returned, sharper than ever. That same day, the village faced a crisis when a woman went into labor. The community gathered, tense and anxious, because childbirth in an isolated place could be dangerous. Zuri froze, imagining herself in that position, terrified and vulnerable. But the aunt handled the delivery with practiced skill and the baby arrived safely. When the newborn was placed in Zuri's arms, something shifted. Holding the baby wasn't an abstract dream anymore. It was real weight, real warmth, real life. Zuri's longing became visible, and the aunt noticed. She told Zuri she would make a good mother, and Zuri, half joking and half sincere, imagined the aunt as a future grandmother. The next morning, Andy commented that carrying a child suited Zuri, and the words lit her up. For the first time, Andy sounded like he was seeing her, not just tolerating her. He teased Brian about winning BBE's attention, pushing him to be bold and steady instead of flashy. Meanwhile, Andy shared his own dream with Zuri, showing her sketches of a house he wanted to build in the village with his future wife. Zuri admired the dream but also saw the gaps in the village's resources. She offered help in the only way she knew how, problem-solving at scale. Zuri used her company to ship laptops and communication devices into the village, turning an isolated community into a connected one almost overnight. She announced the arrival of reliable Wi-Fi, and the villagers reacted as if magic had landed on their doorstep. Soon after, she signed a deal with a construction company to build the long-dreamed bridge, connecting Halupi to the city and changing the village's future. Andy watched her work with admiration, and for the first time, Zuri felt she wasn't just chasing something selfish. She was building something that mattered to others too. As the bridge plan moved forward, a festival night brought emotions to the surface. Under lanterns and music, Andy sang for Zuri, expressing devotion and gratitude, and the village treated it like a public declaration. Brian, pushed by the moment, openly declared his feelings for BBE. The aunt, thrilled, saw the night as the beginning of weddings and new families. Zuri, however, felt trapped. She had never wanted marriage. She had agreed in the moment to avoid ruining the celebration, but inside she panicked. Her plan had been about control, not vows. Later, the aunt spoke warmly to Zuri, believing she and Andy would marry. Zuri asked about Andy's memory loss, and the aunt explained that after returning from Spain, Andy had an accident, and the village lacked the resources for proper treatment. Over time, fragments of the old Andy had started to return, and Zuri's arrival seemed to accelerate that change. Hearing this made Zuri feel guilty. If Andy was recovering because of her, then leaving after getting pregnant would be cruel in a way she could not pretend away. Greg called again, teasing her about marrying Andy, and Zuri admitted she felt torn. She had come for one thing, but now she was entangled in a real community and a real man whose heart was fragile. Still, she tried to push forward, flirting harder, following Andy into private spaces, and searching for a moment to secure what she wanted. That search led her into Andy's house, where she discovered a wall of portraits, dozens of drawings, all of her face. The sight stunned her. Andy confessed he had been drawing her for years, even before she returned, because her face had haunted his memory like a lighthouse. That confession pulled the past into focus. After college, Andy had called her, excited about going abroad for work. Zuri, terrified of being left behind, broke up with him on the spot. Andy spiraled. The accident that cost him his memory happened during that heartbreak, and even in amnesia, Zuri's face remained the one image he could not lose. Hearing this shattered Zuri's defenses. She had told herself love was weakness, but she now saw how deeply her choices had hurt someone who truly cared. Cornered by truth, Zuri finally admitted her real motive. She had returned to find a donor, not a husband. She had picked Andy because he was familiar, and because she believed she could manage the outcome. She offered him a cold deal, a one-day marriage on paper, a pregnancy, and then separation. Andy heard it as the ultimate insult. He accused her of treating him like a tool and of having a heart frozen by selfishness. He walked away, leaving Zuri shaken and exposed. Alone, she cried, realizing she had become the kind of person she once hated, someone who used others to survive. The next morning, Andy destroyed the portraits, symbolically crushing the love he had carried. Zuri returned to her doctor and chose the safer path, deciding to freeze her eggs and put relationships on pause. She threw herself into work again, finalizing the bridge project and securing the village's future through contracts and funding. At the celebration, the project director publicly thanked Zuri and her company, and the villagers cheered. Brian tried again to get closer to BBE, but the aunt pulled him back, still wary of promises. When the crowd cleared, Zuri and Andy shared a final, quiet conversation. Andy said he planned to leave the village and travel abroad, now that the bridge was underway and the community could thrive. He wanted a fresh start, new experiences, and a future with someone who wanted the same kind of life he did. Zuri listened, her eyes soft with regret. She encouraged him, admitting that part of her cared for him, but she also admitted she still wasn't ready to surrender her independence to marriage. Andy replied that he would marry someone who chose life fully, not someone who negotiated love like a contract. They parted with dignity, not hatred. Zuri returned to her city life carrying a new awareness. Control could protect you, but it could also isolate you. Andy returned to his journey carrying a lesson too. Love could survive even amnesia, but it could still be broken by fear and selfishness. In the end, Zuri did not get the child she wanted, at least not yet. But she did something she never expected. She helped build a bridge, not only for a village, but inside herself between ambition and vulnerability. And sometimes that kind of bridge is the first step toward the family you're truly meant to build. Zuri stayed in Halupi longer than she expected, and the days slipped into a rhythm she never thought she could tolerate, let alone understand. Mornings smelled like wood smoke instead of traffic. The aunt kept the house strict but warm, insisting everyone eat together, share chores, and respect the village pace. Zuri, who normally ruled her calendar, had to learn patience. She carried water, helped with meals, and tried to keep her city clothes from turning into farm rags. At first she complained, but she also noticed something rare. People here looked at one another like they mattered. No one was chasing status. They were chasing harvests, weather, and the long-promised bridge that could finally connect their children to a wider world. Andy grew more complex the closer she watched him. Zuri remembered a restless guy with big plans and an easy grin. In Halupi, he still had charm, but it was paired with responsibility. He checked on elderly neighbors, repaired fences, and listened to farmers argue about pests as if it were a board meeting. Memory loss hadn't hollowed him out. It made him careful. He watched people before trusting them, and when he offered kindness, it was deliberate. Zuri tried to pull him closer by inserting herself into village life, joining him in the fields and learning basic farm work. She turned chores into laughter, always testing his reactions. Andy stayed respectful and guarded, treating her like a guest he wanted to protect, not a woman he wanted to chase. That distance irritated her, but it also exposed her own pattern. She chased harder whenever control slipped. Brian's arrival added its own friction. He claimed he came for Zuri, but it was obvious he was drawn to BBE. He tried to impress her with city charm, and she shut him down with sarcasm. Brian, unused to being challenged, became obsessed with earning her respect. He started helping with labor, chopping wood and hauling supplies until his hands blistered. BBE mocked him for being soft, then quietly watched to see if he would quit. Each time he returned the next day, she softened by a fraction, not because she trusted romance, but because consistency mattered in her world. The aunt remained suspicious, warning that Halupi wasn't a vacation love story, and that heartbreak lingered for generations. As Zuri's bridge plan shifted from idea to reality, engineers arrived to measure land and argue routes. Zuri mediated, translating city logic into village language so no one felt dismissed. Construction materials began arriving by boat, and the village reacted like the future had rolled in on metal wheels. Children ran beside the trucks. Elders stood with wet eyes, realizing they might live to see isolation end. But progress also brought fear. Some villagers worried the bridge would invite outsiders, crime, and rising costs. Andy listened to both sides, trying to keep the community steady. Zuri admired how he balanced ambition with caution, and she recognized a leadership style she rarely practiced. She led by speed and pressure. He led by patience and trust. One evening, after a brutal day of planning, Zuri sat outside and watched fireflies float through the dark. The aunt joined her and spoke about motherhood as something bigger than childbirth, something built on showing up and choosing someone other than yourself every day. The words hit Zuri hard. She had always believed independence meant never needing anyone, yet she was desperate for a child precisely because she wanted connection. That night she dreamed of her childhood, of adults blaming her for poverty and calling her cursed. She woke up shaken, realizing she built her empire on a vow never to be helpless. Her fear wasn't only about men or marriage. It was about being abandoned again and loving someone who could leave. As construction accelerated, Zuri received another update from her doctor, confirming that waiting much longer could erase her chance to conceive. The urgency tightened around her chest. She tried to act normal, but her mood shifted. Andy noticed. He didn't understand the details, yet he kept checking on her, offering food first, and defending her when a few villagers questioned her motives. Even without memory, his instincts leaned toward protecting her. That protection made her plan to get pregnant and disappear feel uglier than she wanted to admit. When Andy revealed the portraits, it wasn't only romantic. It was proof that she had never fully left his mind, even through amnesia. The devotion scared her, because it meant love could be persistent, not just passionate. And persistence could break you if you handled it selfishly. That's why Andy's rejection cut so deep. He wasn't rejecting her looks or age. He was rejecting the way she tried to use him to avoid fear. After the fallout, Zuri stayed long enough to finalize the bridge deal because she refused to leave the village half-changed. She focused on work, but the joy was gone. Brian stopped chasing BBE long enough to support Zuri, and his steadier behavior made BBE lower her guard slightly. When the bridge announcement became official, the village celebrated with music and gratitude that felt different from boardroom applause. It wasn't praise for power, it was appreciation for care. Zuri stood at the edge of the crowd and understood something. Success had bought her respect, but it had never bought her belonging. In the end, Zuri returned to the city with no baby and no clean victory, but she carried a clearer map of her own wounds. She froze her eggs to buy time, yet she didn't freeze her humanity. Building a bridge for Halupi became a mirror, showing her the gap between ambition and vulnerability. She realized a child would not fix her fear. Only honesty and healing would. And while Andy left to chase a fresh start, Zuri began her hardest project of all, learning how to love without turning it into a transaction. On the ride back, Zuri replayed every choice like a ledger. She remembered how she once mocked marriage as a broken system, yet she had been craving the safety that commitment can offer when it's real. She also recognized how Andy's village taught her a different kind of strength, the kind that shows up quietly and stays. Back at headquarters, she threw herself into shipments. But she also started therapy, something she used to dismiss as weakness. For the first time, she allowed herself to admit she wanted partnership, not ownership, and that motherhood would feel better if it grew from peace rather than panic. One day soon.